Here at Global Affairs. I going to be simulcasting with K Talk Radio here in just a moment, as soon as their commercial broadcast stops. Boy, a lot of things to catch up on. I hope this new background. I haven't got a green screen yet. I'm going to get a green screen so that all that crappy stuff behind my head disappears. But I kind of like this new screen as a background to what we're doing. So there's the war with Iran, the measles thing in Texas, the fluoride thing in Utah, and the general overall update of the whole planet. That's what I want to talk about. Just never enough time to get everything done that I want to get done. All right. What I hear coming over my phone sounds like old Joe's playing, so I don't know if I am, for those of you listening on the radio, if we've got a couple, if I'm over top of somebody else, I can't do much about that, I'm afraid. What's playing on my phone is not necessarily what's going out over the tower. So I am going to go ahead and get started here with today's program. In the world, well, welcome to the Jack Stockwell Radio Talk Show program, and welcome to my stream, Global Affairs Unfiltered, the truth without a muzzle. Where do you start? What are the things that I want to do? Something very interesting has happened to me over the last few weeks, and my fear is leaving. I am looking at what's going on around the planet without any fear. I'm looking at what's going around the planet from a projection sort of thing that extends from our conscious and unconscious minds that have created what our senses perceive as reality. The only reality that you know is what comes into you through your senses. And senses can be confused. And, you know, it's just like I was watching this YouTube thing of these people doing the fly, rather than using paragliders or something like that, they've got the fly suits. And they're jumping off some rather high elevations, and then the suit goes all the way out to the hands, and it goes down to the feet, kind of like a flying squirrel. And it was interesting because I was watching this not so much to be entertained by flying in a fly suit like this, but I was watching what happened to my brain as these people would be standing on this precipice. I mean, this is just like a 2,000 to 3,000 foot drop, and they would be looking over top of this thing. And immediately, all the muscles in my, even though I'm watching this, seated in a chair, your brain doesn't know the difference. And so as these people with their little cameras on their heads, GoPros, would be looking over the edge, the muscles in my legs and back would freeze for fear of falling off of this height. So the point I'm making is that to my brain, that was reality. But I know in my imaginative sense, there's something deeper than that knew that it was just a projection coming into a part of my brain through my senses. And though it appeared to be real to my brain, to my consciousness, it's not real. Now, if that doesn't confuse you, I don't think there's anything else I can say today that could possibly confuse you any more than that. And so my point is, with all these new confrontations and surprises and shocks, at this point, I think nobody can say whether this is going to end badly or not. or if we can finally move into a whole new paradigm of international cooperation. I think that the war clouds that are gathering over the Middle East, probably among the most worrisome elements, is not filling my heart with fear like it has, in the sense that there's all these things that I've got to do to prepare for the power being cut off and the water being cut off and martial law and on and on and on. The things that I've talked about for 30 years on K-Talk Radio. And there's some controversy where Trump has put this ultimatum to Iran to eliminate its entire nuclear program, not just weapons grade, the entire thing, which is unacceptable to Iran, of course, because they have the right to have a peaceful nuclear program like any other sovereign nation. The effect that has happened inside of my heart and mind over the last couple of weeks has been one where I am observing this now, trying to get a sense of what might be going on, but not in the sense that it's engendering any fear. Just so, thank you, Paul. Apparently I was double broadcasting. I don't have control of that. So, Paul, I thank you for doing that. My whole point is, it all depends. The reality, your reality, how you perceive things, can be changed through an imaginative creation. And the only thing that is really unique to you as a human being is your imaginative sense that separates you from anybody else, in the sense of a truly unique individual. Nobody has your imagination. Nobody has your dreams. And therefore, nobody has the kind of conclusions that you come to in your mind based on your own imagination and creation. Completely unique to you. And as I have been working on that and shaping that in my own mind, I have found my fears disappear. And so when I'm talking to you today, I'm talking to you in a sense of staying up to date on what's going on, because I think we might want to know what's going on, because we still have that individual responsibility for freedom and for taking care of one another. But there's this controversy that constantly smacks up against your reality that you perceive through your senses on an almost hourly basis anymore that's going on around this planet. You're getting hit from every different direction till you're almost senseless until you can get control of your own understanding of the world that you've created. And by created, I mean exactly that. The way you see the world is the result of your own conscious and subconscious creation, based on cultural impressions, based on religious impressions, based on whatever programming you got from your parents as an early childhood, or in school from teachers and school programs. So that by the time you were 7, 8 years old, the person that you are now was pretty well set by the time you were 7 or 8 years old. And child psychologists, one to another, agree with that. So as I go on here talking about these world affairs, I want you to see them, I want you to hear what I'm saying as what they are, not in the sense of meaning anything other than how you interpret that to be. So with that complete muddled mishmash, I want to go on here because there is this fatwa that came out by Khomeini, the supreme leader, that Iran does not desire to have nuclear weapons because it would be against the spirit of Islam. So while the West is still, especially with the focal point of Netanyahu coming to the White House today, to make sure that Trump is going to be behind him when he attacks Iran. The supreme leader has come out and said, hey, we don't, the whole concept of creating such a mass destructive device is contrary to the spirit of Islam. And therefore, by reason of his being the supreme leader, he has told the Iranian engineers there will be no nuclear weapon. Now, of course, the West isn't going to stop at that. The West is just, it's just a bunch of propaganda. We need to bomb them. And the reason that we need to bomb Iran is to get Iran out of the way of Israel so that Israel can continue, Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, and take over everything from practically northern Ethiopia up through Egypt, half of Egypt anyway, all of the Sinai, all of the Mediterranean coast up through Iraq, and moving over to the and Jordan, and moving over towards the Iranian border. That's really what they're after. Now, disregarding the supreme leader's fatwa, there will be no nuclear weapons, Trump is reiterating his ultimatum as recently as yesterday. And at the same time, the B-2 stealth bombers are being shipped to the Diego Garcia base in the Indian Ocean. I'm sure they're there by now. And 3 aircraft carrier groups are on their way to the region in general. Iran has answered all of that by saying that if there is an attack on Iran, it will be answered with a very, very, very severe counterstrike. And I think that can only be interpreted in the sense of the end of Israel. There would be no more Israel. Because even though Iran has said we do not have a nuclear weapon, well, they've still got a lot. They have missiles from China, they have missiles from Russia, and lots of them. In fact, at one point, a month or two ago, maybe as far back as the missile exchange that went on between Iran and Israel, Iran said then, we got 1,000 more of these. No, we have thousands of more of these. We just took out, the ones that got through were the ones that were supposed to get through because they were hypersonic. And they hit military targets. And they said the next time, we'll pepper the nation of Israel with these missiles. Now, this is a trap because it would come to such, if it were to come to such a war, not only could it lead to the explosion of oil prices in the context of, an already extremely tense situation, especially after the tariff war has started as of, last week and going into it this week. It could lead to a complete collapse of the financial system. And it would lead not to the decapitation so much of Iran, but to the decapitation of the Trump administration. And this is the danger that I see, and this is why I'm saying the things that I'm saying about these measures. Even President Trump is getting extremely unhappy and nervous, as I'm sure you've noticed, because Trump won the election with the promise that he not only would end all existing wars, he would start no new ones. And now the strikes on Yemen have already been in violation of that campaign promise. And many of the MAGA people are very, very upset about that. I, for one, if I was a MAGA people, I would be very upset about that. Because this is not what they hoped for in getting Trump into office. And there's a lot of other crisis developments. NATO is still determined to make the enemy image of Russia the prime focus. The European Union defense ministers just met last week in Poland and agreed to go ahead with the 850 billion euro Rearm Europe program regarding Russia as the primary threat, because if Trump is going to cause some diminution of America's interest in NATO, then the NATO nations have got to pick it back up, because that big bad Trump and that lying Putin, big bad Russia and the lying Putin, you just can't you just can't sit back and sit down and talk about peace. So, I'll get to Russia as the primary threat here in a moment. And now NATO is saying that they want to send NATO peace troops for a potential ceasefire in the Ukraine, something which has already been rejected by Russia as completely unacceptable. And it clearly reflects the intention of NATO to keep a permanent point of conflict going on. And then I can only say that the European Union is kind of sorry, there was a state. Yeah, something popped up. So let me go on here for the streamers. Yay, streamers. Otherwise, I can only say the European is in this disarray where the northern countries, Britain, Scandinavia, the Baltics, Germany, Poland, France, are on this course of constantly building up a confrontation with Russia. And while the southern countries and the Balkan countries and the Eastern European countries are all quickly drifting in a totally different direction. So cracks in the EU are clearly there. This does not prevent the European Union Commission from asserting their influence, and the recent shocking experience showing sort of that J.D. Vance, when he addressed the Munich Security Conference and said that Europe is no longer a democratic continent. And of course, there was a huge freak out over that. But the EU is proving this day by day anymore. And the most recent example being the verdict against Marine Le Pen. I mean, she's the leader of the Rassemblement National, the right-wing conservative party in France, and in the polls, she had 37% of the votes, which is almost double what Macron is getting these days. And to eliminate her voting right, they found her guilty of using European Union money for her personal staff in the French campaign. Even the main judge of the Clean Hands scandal in Italy a few years ago came out and said that when he was a member of the European Parliament, he could testify that it's absolutely impossible to completely differentiate when you're deploying your staff for EU purposes and when you're doing it for national purposes. He says it's completely fraudulent. And then when Christine Lagarde was the French economics minister, she was accused of having misdirected 450 million euros to a French businessman at the expense of the French government. And the court ruled that she was not to be fined because she had such an international prestige. And Le Pen obviously has just every bit as much an international prestige. But those political forces who are not liked by the EU Commission, like her and her conservative wing of the French population, that doesn't count because she doesn't want war with Russia. Macron does want war with Russia, but Macron will be out of there very soon. And so Le Pen has been found guilty of something here, misappropriation of funds, which eliminates her from the election. Now, we do something similar to that here in this country. We find all these trumped up charges that Trump, no pun intended, trumped up charges against political leaders to make them look really bad or put them in jail or do something that would lessen their public appeal. And of course, in Trump's case, that backfired, in order to keep them out of the electoral process. So the affairs in Europe right now are just highly problematic. But I wanted to make another topic the main focus of these remarks, and that is the absolutely breathtakingly shocking article which was published by the New York Times in a 13,000-word article, which was the result of a year-long investigation into the Ukraine war. And it was based on interviews with 300 different individuals from different countries. And the New York Times article should be taken, I think, by everybody who's fighting for peace as the absolute reason why this narrative that there was this unprovoked war of aggression by Russia against Ukraine that the story cannot be held up any longer. The article says that not only were there 12 secret spy bases in the Ukraine dating back to 2014, mainly just very shortly from the Maidan coup, but that especially after the initial special military operation had come to a hopeful point of resolution with Istanbul's negotiations where Zelensky and Putin had basically agreed to a ceasefire and a settlement of the crisis 2 weeks into the special military operation. And then Boris Johnson, of course, famously goes to Kyiv and told Zelensky to absolutely keep fighting, saying that they would have all the backing of NATO that they needed. And it turns out now that the New York Times reveals that in Wiesbaden, of all places, Wiesbaden, Germany, in the Clay Barracks, which is the headquarters of the U.S. forces for Europe and Africa, there was a high-level combination of generals and officers, and only 2 months after the Ukraine war had started, these high-level Ukrainian generals went there out of uniform to discuss operations together with the CIA and the U.S. military forces. This is just here recently in the New York Times, for Pete's sake. Then the article describes in great detail all the many operations which were conducted from Wiesbaden in the Ukraine. Excuse me. And then, for example, helping the Ukrainians to go after the famous 58th Army of Russia, where several times they knocked out the leadership. Then the army relocated. Then with the help of American reconnaissance, the new location was detected, and then the new leadership was killed. And this happened many times. And also the CIA was involved in the attack on Sevastopol, in the chasing of the Russian fleet in the Black Sea. It also says that the Biden administration, while officially not giving permission for certain offensive operations, secretly gave the go-ahead and helped Ukraine to conduct these secret operations. In the New York Times. So there's no question that it was what the Russians had said all along, that this wasn't a conflict between the Ukraine and Russia. It was a proxy war between the United States and Russia, and between NATO and Russia. And so the entire American Secret Service, CIA, NSA, DIA, NGA, they were all involved, and and there's records to show how they all discussed among themselves the plausible denial that would be necessary to cover this up. And they said that if you ever ask, if you hit a Russian target, you couldn't call it a target, you would call it a point of interest. So when you ask, you can say, nobody ever targeted something in Russia, for Pete's sake. And so the CIA, we know now, because of this article in the Times, was involved with the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, and so forth and so on. So it begins to be very obvious to anyone doing any kind of an honest investigation of what's going on here that this was all orchestrated from the CIA from the beginning. And I think this New York Times article should be read by anybody who is interested in establishing the peace and as confirming what the Russian version of what has been said for the last 3 years is the correct one. And therefore the politicians who have been peddling that for the last 3 years should officially correct their views for honesty's sake. And I believe that only if the truth about what happened is reestablished and also the root cause of the crisis addressed, well, because when you come in contact when you get to a level where you detect, when you look at the manipulation of this narrative, then you can find a solution. If you don't do that, you're going to be kept in the web of lies forever until it's too late. And that's marks the incredible significance of this New York Times article. So I just, if you are caught discussing this with some people who still think the Russians are the big bad guys and Putin's the big bad liar and the KGB and wants to dominate and take over all of Europe, you might refer to that New York Times article. Now, I'm usually very respectful of Professor Starr in any case, and also Scott Ritter. But I think he overlooks something at this point with what I'm talking about here, especially when he reiterated that this would be catastrophic. This further militarization of the Ukraine. And also the, I used to call it the coming attack on Iran. I don't know if it still is a coming attack. I still haven't got Trump figured out to my satisfaction. But this whole Middle East thing, this Iran is obviously important for the Iranians. The whole Middle East is important for all the people who live there, obviously. But from the standpoint of major geopolitical powers in the world, the Middle East has always been the cockpit of the geopolitical games. And from the standpoint of strategic development, the only relevant game in town is the nascent renewal of the relationship between the United States and Russia. And the fact that Putin and Trump started to have a dialogue, and there were some first steps going in the right direction. I think this is what what this is targeting. I mean, I would like Ritter to really reconsider this, because I know he's very knowledgeable about Russia and so forth, but I think he misses this crucial point, and that is the British, who are clearly documented instigators of the Ukrainian war again and again, and that it was Boris Johnson who nixed the potential to come to a settlement back in March, April, 3 years ago now, 3 years ago this month. And right now they are instigating the continuation both of the coalition of the willing. At the same time, they're pushing for war, a decapitation strike against Iran. So the former MI6 head, Richard Dearlove, famously said that Iran is the biggest threat to the Jews in Great Britain. Just think about that for a minute. The former head of MI6, MI6, of course, is the British CIA. And he said that Iran is the biggest threat to the Jews in Great Britain. So, I mean, he's just egging the United States on. They want this attack against Israel. I mean, Iran to open up the pathway for Israel to subjugate the entire area, as I said. And what I said briefly there in the opening remarks, that this whole operation is not potentially over the decapitation of the Iranian government. It's designed to decapitate the Trump administration at the same time and throw off course this present dialogue development that's going on between Trump and Putin. So whatever I can do to get the Trump administration, little old Jack, to review this urgently is needed, because I think for all the reasons which have been described by Professor Starr, and hopefully I got time to get to that, and because of what happens with nuclear conflict. But there's this strategic trap that's going on right now to derail this stuff, to ruin the U.S.-Russia dialogue. And I just want to add one more thing. If Trump would do what was portrayed, it would ruin his reputation forever to attack Iran. It'd be the absolute death blow to his image, and I think it'd be the worst thing he could do for his own self-interest and the America First interest. I mean, it would be devastating for American interests. But I think the situation with Iran just illustrates that the security, uh, it has to be indivisible and is indivisible with the new security heads that we have. I mean, why is Iran trying to play around with always having the contingency to develop nuclear weapons? And it's because Israel has nuclear weapons, pure and simple. And I think that fact is not being counted in the discussions at all. I hardly ever see anybody referring to Israel's nukes. And so I can understand why on the surface the Ayatollah would come out with a fatwa and prohibit any nuclear weapon development taking place in Iran, because it's contrary to the spirit of Islam to have something like that. And at the same time, just turned a blind eye to what might be going on behind the scenes, because Israel has nukes. Now, when you look at this in the sense of one empire coming and going and another empire coming and going, and the Western Empire I mean, essentially centered in London, but involves Germany and France and Spain, Portugal, Italy, the United States, in their efforts to subjugate and control the rest of the planet. I've talked about this many, many times. If you look at the long arc of human history, of universal history, we've kind of reached a point now that I think has never really existed before. When other cultures and civilizations collapsed, like the Roman Empire, there was this Renaissance period in India that was going on at the same time the Roman Empire was collapsing. It was called the Gupta period, G-U-P-T-A, the Gupta period. And people didn't know about it because it sometimes took years to travel and get back. And it was like a completely compartmentalized development. But this time it's very different. I mean, we're truly sitting in one boat because of nuclear weapons, because of the internet, because of pandemics. And all you got to do is throw in a little AI and all kinds of things which makes us even further interconnected than it has been, quite some time now. You can only address the problems of humanity all at once. You can't settle Ukraine and think that solves the problem and just leave the Middle East in shambles, or solve the problem of Africa and leave Ukraine alone. Now we got to put some justice into the entire architecture, which can only come from elevating the whole discussion above geopolitics. And I think the idea that one country or a group of countries has a legitimate interest against another group of countries just can't work any longer. I mean, geopolitics is a disease which in the 21st century now, with nukes, can lead to an indescribable catastrophe. And so then what is the alternative to geopolitics? I mean, you have to look at one humanity as one entity hanging together. I mean, you say first, well, you have to do whatever is in the interest of one humanity. And then you have to define what the national interest is, and that's obviously only possible if you introduce a dynamic of development. Because if you just move pieces of a puzzle around on the strategic board, you don't come to a solution. But if you introduce real development that is in the interest of everybody, then you can figure out all the individual solutions. And I think the idea is also a certain sense forced upon the world because it will affect the financial collapse and the transatlantic financial system. It'll affect the entire world. So where am I going with this? I think the present political leadership in much of Europe, not all, but some countries, like the top government in Britain, the top government in France, Fortunately, Merz is not chancellor yet, but he may be. They're running into a lot of infighting, a lot of disagreement, and there needs to be a serious strategic investigation to all of this. I mean, there's so many laws that, I mean, it's completely insane. As I said last week, the Bundeswehr going into schools, youth officers trying to recruit 17-year-olds to join the army. I mean, there's this whole insane militarization as if two world wars never happened in Europe and we don't have to reflect back on those things. It's as if people have written off any memory that if you start to invest large-scale sums into weaponry, as happened in 1928, 1933 Germany, and then from 33 to 38 Germany, you get a sense of what's going on here. I think the crisis is economic, it's military, it's cultural. But why is it that people, even here in America, do not learn that eventually our children, our grandchildren are going to die in this coming war? Or maybe we'll all die, depending on how quickly it comes. And I think the only way is that in Europe, they have to address this cultural decay that's going on. But there's no real difference between the last phase of the Roman Empire and what is happening the world over. I mean, the sexual perversion, the pornography, the child trafficking, the violence for violence sake. We have to get back to a classical culture. And I look at the Chinese and I see what the Chinese are doing in this regard. And so I guess a couple of the points that I kind of want to make here is that we're truly in a revolutionary period right now, where the old order is disintegrating and disintegrating more and more to the point where it's beginning to stink day by day. And what the new order is going to be will be entirely due to the efforts of some very good people who understand the only direction that can possibly save this planet from its own impending self-imposed destruction is going to be to sit down in the spirit of the Treaty of Westphalia and take care of each other's concerns in the sense that would lead to true economic productive development between them. Instead of this rules-based, one command, one government, one will that has ruled the world for 400 or 500 years now. Now, if you go back, I mean, a new world order is absolutely taking shape. As a matter of fact, you have today in the BRICS plus countries, which now I think has 22 members, and almost 40 to 50 countries that have applied for membership. It's a system not based on the neoliberal model of economy by any means, but on a win-win cooperation that promotes the well-being of each other. And with that is the end of an epoch. The 500 years of colonialism that started in Europe around 1500 is definitely ending. And I don't think that this genie can ever be put back in the bottle, because the countries of the global south are now in a process of realignment. They want to get rid of the chains of the institutions which promoted and continued the neo-colonialism. And already many of these countries have gained independence. And the idea is that they no longer want to be raw materials producing countries for the benefit of Western nations that then prohibit these countries from developing any further themselves. And it's quite obvious that the reason they're capable of doing that is because they have the cooperation of China. And then, of course, this is something the West is scared to death of, and that's why Hegseth has been over in Indochina area quite a bit, trying to foment an attitude of war with China. I mean, it gets to the point where it's just so obvious you can almost forecast what's going to happen next, in the sense of trying to move the world closer and closer to war. And despite the fact that when you, I mean, the promises, the promises that were made to Russia, very clearly given to Gorbachev and Shevardnadze, not to extend NATO 1 inch further east if they would agree to the reunification of East and West Germany. And there are now many archived documents which have been declassified. Everybody can read them, see what's there. Not one promise by Secretary of State Baker to Gorbachev, but many of the promises, they're all recorded. And Genscher, G-E-N-S-C-H-E-R, in a famous speech in January of 1990 in Tutzing at the Protestant Academy in Germany, promised that never would NATO ever move to the east, that never would NATO troops ever be on the territory of East Germany. And there's no question that there are many, literally dozens of discussions where that promise was made to not move NATO 1 inch to the east. And despite the fact that these promises were made, you already had the neocons in Washington and their collaborators in London plotting to use this to create a unipolar world based on the Anglo-American special relationship. That is absolute treason to the Constitution of the United States and the people of the United States. And when the people nowadays are saying, we need NATO in Sweden, we need NATO in Finland, and they say there's this unprovoked war by Russia and Ukraine, and that is why you have to have all these NATO expansions, is simply not true. All right, station identification. And so we now have the documents which absolutely prove the Russians were cheated. They were lied to. In good faith, they reacted to these promises, which is amazing given the fact that only 40 plus years after the end of the Second World War, and given the part that Germany is causing this war and inflicting incredible suffering on Russia, which they called the Great Patriotic War, in light of all that, it was extremely generous for the Soviets and then by the Russians to allow the peaceful reunification of Germany. And I think it's important to restate that because that was the beginning of the present crisis, at least that we have in Europe. And so obviously, what happened was that the neocons immediately proceeded step by step to go for regime change, for color revolution, expansion of NATO. In the beginning, you could say the East European countries wanted to be part of the West, and even so, that's not exactly what happened because many of the so-called leaders of the Eastern European countries had before had their careers, their very wealthy, productive, professional careers in the United States and inside of Britain. And then they were chosen to be the heads of these new governments. But that's a different story. In any case, in the beginning, the Russians were very patient and allowed the first expansions of NATO. Poland, Czechoslovakia, even Romania, Bulgaria. They went ahead and agreed to it, even though they had been promised over and over again this would not happen. The Russians wanting to be able to maintain trade and some degree of trust learned even further to greatly distrust the West when they brought in Poland, Czechoslovakia, Romania, and Bulgaria into NATO. And then when it came to the Ukraine, it became like the reverse Cuban Missile Crisis. It already was before that with the installation of defensive missile systems in Poland, in Romania, part of the Aegis system, which the Russians at that time opposed because they argued that these defensive systems could be changed into offensive systems in a matter of hours. So they protested this and said there's a red line that they cannot allow to be crossed. And then with the Maidan, which was a coup orchestrated by the Anglo-Americans, Victoria Nuland bragging that the State Department spent $5 billion on the Ukraine alone. So they played a big role in it. I only want to touch upon this to remind you that because nowadays the Maidan is being characterized as a peaceful expression of the democratic will of the people, But we were so close to the situation that we can testify as eyewitnesses that it was the coup orchestrated by the West. And then in the beginning, the Minsk I and the Minsk II Accords would have been possible to solve the problem by giving greater autonomy to the eastern part of the Ukraine, by allowing the Russian-speaking people to have the autonomous rights while still being part of the Ukraine. But as we know, Merkel and Holland lied through their teeth. They never had the intention to implement the Minsk agreement. Merkel and Hollande said that it was done to gain time for the Ukrainian military to be trained to the level of NATO. And obviously, this has all been a part of the Brzezinski plan. That if you deprive Russia from having spheres of influence over the Ukraine, Russia, according to Brzezinski, is no longer a world player, just a regional power, or as they said, as he said, a gas station with tanks, which is completely insulting to Russia as well. And then somebody comes along here in the last 4 years and describes Russia as a gas station with nukes. In the meantime, the NATO borders were extended more than 1,000 kilometers to the east. Jim Baker said, not 1 inch further. If you will allow the reunification of Germany, NATO will not expand 1 inch further. Now it's over 1,000 miles. And in the 6th expansion of NATO with Sweden and Finland, naturally you had the brutal sanctions, I think 12 or 13 times by the EU alone, trying to ruin Russia. That was what was Baerbock's slogan out of Germany. And the sanctions included the weaponization of the dollar and stealing 300 billion of assets from Russia, that they still have, mind you, 9 billion from Afghanistan, many other billions from other countries like Venezuela, led to the situation where these developing countries, looking at all of that, realize that all of a sudden that what is happening with Russia and China is very much the same thing that happened to colonialism in respect to these various countries. And that is why the countries of the global South never agreed to buy the NATO narrative that this war was unprovoked. They always remained neutral, sticking to the position and the tradition of the non-aligned movement when all this exploded, and of course the blowback was gigantic. In the meantime, because the rise of China, which in large part was the shift originated with Deng Xiaoping with the reform and opening up policies starting in 1978, then China had undertaken the biggest civilizational miracle in the history of mankind ever, because they lifted in the next 20 years 850 million people out of poverty, bringing the middle class in China to presently about 400 million people. Yes, China has a middle class. They even eliminated poverty in the far remote parts of the west of China and the other parts of the interior. And because of that, and because of Xi Jinping's announcement in September of 2013 of the new Silk Road, which was very much resembled what the Schiller Institute had promoted in the 1990-91 Eurasian Land Bridge. In any case, China was the only country which responded to these ideas and started this incredible transformation. Now, I've used the example of my son many times. When he first went to China, which, oh my goodness, 20 years ago now? I mean, he was born in '82. So that would be 18 and 25 would be 43. So he's in his early 40s. And he went there just a year or two out of high school. So that's 20 years ago. And when he got there, he was brought in by a company that makes money teaching English to Chinese children after the Chinese schools have let out for the day. And it's an accelerated type of class. And I think he spent the first 6 months he was there learning English to a level where he could be teaching it to these Chinese children. And of course, these Chinese children, their English was much better than his Mandarin, as he's trying to teach them English. But he got along with them pretty good. But the point I wanted to make is, that at least once a day he was being stopped on the street by the Chinese state police, wanting to see his papers. He said, "Dad, you don't go anywhere. You do not go anywhere without those papers." And by the time he left, boy, almost a decade, not quite a decade, almost a decade later, he said, "Dad, you hardly ever saw state police anywhere." And I said at the time, "Christian, it's probably because they know you. They've seen you there for years. You've never been a threat to the state." And no, he said, "It's the same thing with the newbies coming in to teach English. They hardly ever get bothered, never get hassled. The last thing you would do," he said when he first got there, "if you were a Chinese native, is to actually try to produce something and sell it out on the street outside of your own job with the state." When he left, he said, "You can always tell the time of day because within 30 minutes after the end of the work shift for the day of state workers, the streets were full of people with their tables and stuff they had been making during the night to sell in the sense of open trade, free enterprise out on the streets to one another." Now, when I say that over a 20-year period, 850 million Chinese were lifted out of poverty to a middle-class status of living, that's what I'm referring to. And now my son and his Chinese wife and my Chinese granddaughter, living in Modesto, California, she regularly goes to China to visit the family. The family in China regularly comes over here to visit her because she's the only child because of the one-child policy, which is not the case anymore, mind you, but it was then. And they freely come back and forth without any hassle or problems with state police. And so that kind of peaceful coexistence is the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And this is what Xi Jinping was all about with the new Silk Road back in 2013, that would open up this kind of cultural awakening, not just in China, but in Europe as well, as the old Marco Polo trade routes would reopen, and now with high-speed rail, so that something that was manufactured in Paris 48 hours later would be in Beijing on the streets for sale. And the stuff that was manufactured in Shanghai or Beijing or Chongqing, way up in the north where my son was, in Jilin province, or all the way down in Hong Kong, any of these places, those products could be in Paris or in Germany or in Austria or Poland or any of the side routes of that Silk Road in 48 hours. What would that do between the countries of Western Europe and the countries of Eastern Asia, doing trillions of dollars of business every year? All right, I have to, I'm going to continue with the stream, obviously. And, all right. While the K-Talk goes to break in the news. So the whole idea of peaceful coexistence that came out of the Treaty of Westphalia for 150 years, these countries have been fighting each other, mainly the Protestants and the Catholics, sat down and said, you know what? We don't necessarily have to beat our swords into plowshares, but we might want to keep our swords. But, you know, what do you want? Let me turn this down. What do you want? What kind of business do you want to do? Well, you guys got oil. You got more oil than we have. And what do you have? Well, we have strategic minerals. Why don't we sit down and work out a way that we can trade these things back and forth, have open borders between us, and do some trade? And and that out of the Treaty of Westphalia, but also this is the Chinese design, because when's the last time China attacked somebody? When was the last time China was an aggressor? And there it is. There's the news. And, well, you can't tell me a time. Oh, Taiwan. Yeah, that's just talk. The reason that China is building up their military in that area is because we're building up our military in that area. And then Hegseth going to the Philippines with missiles, for Pete's sake. So my whole point is that with China based on Confucianism, and Confucius was anti-war, as was Buddha, as was Jesus. That you're so much better off to sit down with your enemy, you know, and so was Michael Corleone, you know, keep your enemies closer, find out what, you know, let's see if we can't do business, because when you got two people who would just as soon kill each other, suddenly find a way to make money off of each other, you know, then they can sit down and start having dinners instead of, you know, sending poison pen letters. Start talking about the things that unite them. So when you have a situation where absolutely the majority of the world population, 85%, are absolutely determined now to create a whole new world economic order based on justice, based on the 5 principles of peaceful coexistence, based on the United Nations Charter, so that that process could be good and just develop, except that the forces of the old system, the old neoliberal system, the old colonial system, doesn't want that to happen because they want to keep control over what they think is their rightful position to set the rules. To keep in operation a unipolar world that no longer exists. And then the next shock came with the election of President Trump in the United States, because Trump, being a victim of this unipolar faction, of the deep state in his first administration, completely changed the agenda, upended the table, and he set out to do the unforgivable thing of normalizing relations with Russia. And that is not, and when, if you were to take Russia out of the picture, in the sense of this military monster in the middle of Eurasia, who just can't wait to take over the whole world and reestablish Soviet-style communism. If you took Russia out of the picture, what is there left to be afraid of? The Chinese aren't going anywhere. The Chinese aren't doing anything. They're just increasing the technology of their productive capabilities. You see the recent news yesterday and this morning, the war between the United States and Russia or China as to who's going to develop overall powering AI the fastest. I hope you can't hear that. The irritation on the news there from K-Talk. And so Trump comes in to normalize relations with Russia. He comes in to normalize relations with China, except the power of the deep state that's still very much there in Washington through the bureaucratic offices want colonial power to remain. They want the rules-based unipolar world to remain. And so there's no room for China getting uppity, and there's no room for Russia and China together doing deals with African nations that would bring Africa out of the dark ages and bring them into the 21st century. There's just no room for that kind of stuff. And Trump has a different conception of U.S. strength. He expressed it through Make America Great Again. That also applies maybe to making Greenland, if need be militarily. I mean, to grab a hold of Greenland and militarily take the Panama, if only through BlackRock owning the ports and taking it away from Chinese influence. I mean, and attach Canada as the 51st state. I mean, that's all nice and sweet, and it may not be what we want, and certainly not what the Canadians or the Greenlanders want. I never said that I think that Trump is anywhere close to what needs to be done as far as foreign normalization with Russia is concerned, which I, of course, support. Because anybody should be happy that the two largest nuclear powers on the planet have a decent relationship with each other, at least where the leading spokespeople of both countries, the presidents, sit down and talk. But this was regarded naturally as a mortal threat to the underpinning control of the special relationship between the United States and Great Britain. And this special relationship is what carried the attempt to impose. All right. It sounds like the broadcast finished at K-Talk, so I'll just continue here with what I'm talking about to the stream. That this was finally the success of the British Empire, and this special relationship is what carried the attempt to impose a unipolar world system. I mean, once Great Britain realized they couldn't conquer the United States, and they learned that in 1812 to 1814. Or at least they couldn't militarily conquer the United States. Then they had to get, the only way they could get the United States under their control was through two avenues. Number one, financial, get control of the American banking system, which they have done admirably ever since, even before 1917, but then by federal law from 1917 on. And also through the seduction of the leading characters of American system of government to be brought in as special relationship people, special friends. I mean, look, what did George Bush Jr. do with the Queen of England right after he was elected? What did Obama do? Trump did it, but he didn't do it as fast as Obama did. And then Biden, of course. Go directly to the seat of the special relationship, the throne of England, and get on your knees and swear fealty. And this is the final success of the British Empire, which they had never give up on from the very moment the American War of Independence declared independence of the American Republic. And the War of Independence was really the first anti-colonial war in history, where a colony of a greater power actually declared independence and won the War of Independence. This was, when you consider America being the first anti-colonial war, the British, for their part, had never given up on the fact that they lost, as I was saying here while the K-Talk was on a news break. They said, look, America, the first anti-colonial war, and the Britons lost their they had several colonies. At the same time they had the United States, they had several others. But the United States was the most important one. And they have always tried to reconquer it, as I said, first militarily with the War of 1812, and then militarily with the Civil War. And yes, the Civil War was another war against the United States from Britain, and finally realized they couldn't win militarily. So they decided they had to corrupt the American establishment to adopt the model of the British Empire as the basis for the unipolar world, and then run the world together based on the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States. Now, I've said special relationship many times. Special relationship means several things, but most important, it means the sharing of strategic intelligence. What MI6 knows, CIA knows. What CIA knows, MI6 knows. And when they decide that there's somebody out there that's a no-goodnik that needs to be gotten rid of, it'll usually be a combination of some British SAS and some U.S. SEALs, and go take out the bad guy. Now, when Trump won the election, he knew perfectly well the British role in the sabotage of his first administration with Russiagate. So he set out to get back at them and eliminate the deep state by essentially appointing a number of people like Tulsi Gabbard as Director of National Intelligence, Kash Patel as head of the FBI, like the new head of the CIA and some of the others, and releasing the documents of the Kennedy assassination and Russiagate. And all of that is now subject to being investigated, and the culprits are looking potentially, hopefully, at jail sentences. And many of them have had their security clearances lifted already, so there's a state of war inside the U.S. administration. When you hear about another round of top security individuals under George Bush Jr. all the way up through Biden suddenly losing their security clearances, what does that mean? Well, they just can spend their time watching the final NCAA basketball championship game tonight and not worry about what's going on as far as international intelligence, intrigue, war, all that kind of stuff is concerned. No, it doesn't mean that at all. What it means simply is get ready, because you're not going to have American intelligence on your side anymore, and prosecutions are coming, as there should be. And now comes the not so nice, the not so nice side of the Trump administration. And that is that they have never broken with the Zionist lobby. While Trump and crew have had problems with English ambassadors and French ambassadors, and Trump has made comments about various European leaders that go back to his first administration, Trump has never broken with the Zionist lobby. He hasn't broken with the Christian Zionists in the United States. And because of that, they have never broken with Israel. And Israel, as we all know, unfortunately, has been committing a war of genocide for a year and a half against Gaza, and now almost increasingly against the West Bank. And this puts it at odds with anybody who's upholding the rule of law, if you mean anything by these words. And the British now have launched a campaign to get the United States, and naturally Israel as well, and the British influence of Israel is really big, as was just emphasized by the former head of MI16, Sir Richard Dearlove. They want to get the United States to make war against Iran, as I was saying in the first hour. This is a very hot situation. It's very dangerous. I mean, if you look at it, as I've said a number of times, the United States is gathering about 7 B-2 stealth bombers in the Indian Ocean at the base of Diego Garcia. They're deploying the refueling airplanes that have to go with them. And they're also sending together 3 aircraft carriers into the region. And there is mounting talk that the United States would wage war against Iran. Some people are using the term decapitating strike, with the argument that maybe we don't need to use nukes because nuclear weapons are the only way to eliminate the nuclear facilities in Iran, because they're deep inside these mountains. You can't even do it with the natural or the normal bunker buster bombs. So you need to use nuclear weapons if you really want to destroy these nuclear facilities. But there's some people now in Washington and elsewhere who are saying, we don't need to nuke them. We can just decapitate them using the same method we used with the IDF against Hezbollah in Lebanon, and how we eliminated the president of Assad in Syria by just very quickly moving the HTS government in there. And we can likewise have a decapitating strike against Iran and then move in a regime which is pro-Israel and pro-US. And why pro U.S. cheap oil? Why pro Israel? To let Israel continue to gather more and more ground. Unfortunately, this is not totally impossible that Trump may actually do that. But the real aim of it, if the British-Israeli combination succeeds to lure Trump into a war with Iran, then that would have its net effect of a decapitation strike against Trump, because this would completely ruin the Trump presidency and almost absolutely ensure a majority of Democrats in the House and Senate in a year and a half from now. That's right. Well, a little more than a year and a half, but the midterms, a year from now, they're going to be campaigning. They're already campaigning. Cory Booker is already campaigning for president. But the House of Representatives very shortly are going to be campaigning again for the 26 elections. And so if this war were to break out, the decapitation strike against the Trump presidency, it would probably cause the price of oil to go to at least $100 or more per barrel, maybe even twice as much, which could trigger a crash of the financial system, which is completely fragile, ready to blow anyway. And that's the immediate danger, and naturally the British have now probably entrapped the new scandal against Trump, this Signalgate thing. In the first administration, it was Russiagate. Now they have this so-called Signalgate, which is really the incompetent use by the entire national security team of Trump to discuss very concretely the bombing of Yemen over a non-secure channel. That's all that was about. How can you imagine that the heads of the FBI, CIA, National Director of Intelligence are so inexperienced and so incompetent that they would allow this to happen? Well, to allow a journalist, an editor of the Atlantic magazine, who used to be a prison guard for the IDF in Israel, to participate in these discussions. And the minimum you can say is that it shows a severe weakness of this group. But naturally, this is now being exploited to the hilt to try to oust exactly these same people, Kash Patel and Tulsi Gabbard. This would blind Trump and do to him in the second administration, which was very successful, with Bolton and Pompeo against Trump in the first administration. So this is going on. This is kind of hot. Hot. It could come to a war with Iran, which would throw the world into a terrible crisis. And we have to do, I have to do, you have to do everything to dissuade that. But this is unfortunately not the only problem, because in the meantime, the Europeans, rather than being happy that there is a rapprochement between the United States and Russia, which is still going somewhere and still some hope that it can succeed, they decided to sabotage it and prolong the war in Ukraine by creating this coalition of the willing and promising to send long-range weapons to Ukraine. I just heard Van der Leyen saying that over the weekend. Oh, my goodness. This would manipulate the acting president, Zelensky, to sabotage the de facto potential of a peace agreement between the United States and Russia. And at the same time, they want to go for an unprecedented militarization of the European Union, of Germany. Ursula von der Leyen was also saying she intends to spend up to 800 billion euros to rearm Europe. Now, who's going to get excited about that? And she's really intending to do that. And in Germany, the new government used the trick of using a two-thirds majority of the previous already voted out parliament to change the Constitution to allow a loosening of the debt brake to create limitless money for the militarization of Germany. Prior to this vote, there was an amendment in the German Constitution of a debt brake. You can't spend more than this for that, or this for that, or this for that. That's it. And they had to get rid of that if they're going to remilitarize Germany. This is terrible. I mean, The whole world is shocked that Germany, only 80 years after the Second World War, would engage in, again, militarization in the sense of building and sending tanks against Russia, as if they didn't learn anything from Operation Barbarossa. But even worse than that, it potentially makes Germany a target if it comes to war with Russia. In that case, nothing of Russia would, or nothing of Germany would be left, nor any other country that would be a part of this. And they just, maybe Putin needs to send another Oreshnik missile. Well, sounds like there might be a break at K-Talk. Give me a second. Yep. So anyway, we're in an incredible situation here. I'm going to continue with you streamers. And the mechanisms are known. This is exactly what Hallmar Schacht did with the war machine of the Nazis. This is money creation outside of the regular budget, and its lead up to World War II was called the MEFO bills, M-E-F-O. I've talked about it before. And now the mechanism is creating extra budgets and basically doing the same thing that was done up to 80 years ago. So if you look at the picture, the question naturally is, what's the way out? How do you step down from this? Where's the way out of this? At least when the special military operation started in February of 2022 in the Ukraine, I immediately said back then that this has now reached a point in world history where you cannot solve the problems on a regional or national basis. You have to move the whole world to a whole new paradigm. And as I've mentioned, the Peace of Westphalia, what they did back in 1648, when the war parties realized that after 150 years of religious wars, that a continuation of the wars would just simply lead to nobody being left to enjoy the victory because everybody would be dead. And now in the age of thermonuclear weapons, if any nuclear weapon was ever used, it is the logic of the difference between nuclear war and conventional war that all weapons would be used. And that, in all likelihood, would be the end of civilization, the end of mankind. And that is why there's such an appeal to reason, to tell the people there's a new paradigm like the Peace of Westphalia, based on the interest of all parties. Because if you leave even one country out, if you leave out Russia, if you leave out China, like the G7 just did ridiculously, leaving Russia out, or it had been the G8. If you leave out one country, let it be Russia, let it be China, let it be North Korea, let it be Iran, it won't work. You have to establish a new security and development architecture that includes the interests of every single country. When you consider the nature of man, and that is the absolute 100% conviction, I didn't always feel this way, but I do now, that man by his very nature is basically good and wants peace and happiness for his companion, for his children, for his community, for his country, for his football team. They want to be able to go to work, provide something, have a home. They're not out basically trying to kill everybody, although there are those interests that get a hold of our intelligence services and a hold of our military, a hold of our president, and steer what could be the power of such great goodness. And again, I contrast that with the People's Liberation Army of China and the People's Republic of whatever they call it, a communist nation, turning it into a one-world country where 850 million Chinese over the last 20 years have moved from dire poverty to the middle class. Living in homes, having jobs, having cars, having phones. Yes, there's certain limitations on the internet in this communist country. Yes, there's certain things that are still that we are approaching where they don't have complete freedom. Yes, but they're moving that way all the time. And the Communist Party of China realizes this. If they want to stay in power, they've got to give the citizens something, some taste of freedom, because that's where revolutions come from. And now you have, well, I'm not going to repeat it. I've said it enough times. And so when you consider that man is good by nature, in the sense that the human mind, the human character, the human soul are infinitely perfectible. There's no limit to the increase, the perfection of the human mind and the human character that can become infinitely good. The fact that there is still evil in the world is just a reflection of the lack of development that would allow these things to take place. And I'm not talking about a utopian wish, and I'm not some kind of Pollyanna type thing. That most people, given the right set of circumstances, would gladly live in peace and not surrender their sons, and in some cases their daughters, to be sacrificed. All right, now, I think I'm going to move into a different direction altogether now. Rubio was making some comments recently that the U.S. will not abandon NATO. Don't worry. All right, let me go on to a couple of other ideas. I just saw this recent article by Paul Craig Roberts. Well, it's at paulcraigroberts.org on will the West's paranoia of Russia destroy the world? And I wanted to quote a little bit from it because I read it this morning, and I thought it was a really, really good article. No doubt about it. He says, do you remember the James Bond film in which a deranged Soviet general wanted to launch a nuclear war? Or Dr. Strangelove, an American deranged general who wanted to do the same? Well, Dr. Strangelove is still with us. He's just no longer considered insane. And today's Pentagon spreading nuclear weapons among the allies who lack them in order to conduct an even larger nuclear war is just good war planning. You may have heard this, that there are nations in NATO who are members of NATO who do not have nukes, but want them. And they don't want to go to the expense of making them. So on April 1st, and unfortunately it was not an April Fool's joke, the nominee as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Dan Kane, said that the United States was ready to consider entering into nuclear sharing agreements with more of the country's NATO allies. He said this: from a military perspective, expanding NATO's allies' participation in the nuclear deterrence mission in some capacity would enhance flexibility, survivability, and military capability. If confirmed, I will work to evaluate the cost-benefit of such a decision, meaning passing out nuclear weapons to NATO countries. Then he said that another benefit of providing nuclear weapons to NATO members, he said, who don't have them, is to prevent nuclear proliferation resulting from acquiring them on their own. He said if too many of our allies have the weapons, the U.S. would not be able to manage the escalation risk. Like it's our job to do that. He says He said this: "We do not want Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, Germany, Poland launching a nuclear war." Well, that makes sense. But what this common sense hides is the absurdity of managing a nuclear war. He said, if too many of our allies get these weapons, how would we ever manage that? Well, who put you in the nuclear war management position? There's a consensus, or close to one anywhere, that nuclear war would be lethal to the life on this planet. And it calls to mind, as Roberts is saying, the novel *A Canticle for Leibowitz*, with this spaceship loading with human, animal, and plant life for a distant planet in a short time of trying to remain prior to nuclear Armageddon on Earth. And this, of course, is the Pentagon's job is to prepare for war. But as the war the Pentagon is preparing for is unwinnable, why not attempt to prepare for peace? What cause is worth fighting for if it ends with the death of the entire planet? So, as Roberts is saying, these thoughts entered the mind of President John F. Kennedy. JFK had campaigned as a cold warrior, proclaiming a missile gap. And somehow Eisenhower won World War, as the World War II hero and five-star general, somehow during his 8 years in office let the Soviets get ahead of us. And then Kennedy was rescued from his delusion about the missile gap by the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs. And he refused the request to allow the U.S. Air Force to support the CIA's Cuban Refugee Army invasion of Cuba. And he refused the Joint Chiefs Staff's Northwoods Project. Remember that? Which called for the United States Air Force to shoot down U.S. passenger airliners, staff boats of refugees from Cuba to Florida, kill Americans on the streets of Miami and Washington, D.C., and then blame Castro as justification for the U.S. invasion of Cuba. He rejected the Joint Chiefs plan for nuclear attack on the Soviet Union, and all this information is publicly available, just few are very aware of it. So Kennedy worked behind the scenes with Soviet leader Khrushchev to defuse that dangerous situation. And instead of recognizing Kennedy's leadership, the United States military security complex saw Kennedy as soft on communism, a traitor in the making to America who had to be removed from office. And as Kennedy was popular, assassination, of course, was the solution. Roberts says he agrees with James Douglas, Oliver Stone, and all of the rest that Kennedy was murdered by the U.S. security state. He says, where I depart from them is over whether it should have been revealed or covered up. Because here, facts are not the issue, just judgment, and judgment is not infallible. He said, I do not believe that anyone on the Warren Commission believed the report. Well, I'm of the same opinion. The entire purpose of the report was to protect the American public from losing confidence in their own government in the midst of a dangerous Cold War with nuclear-armed opponent in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis in the Bay of Pigs. With the balance of power in the world at stake, the United States would have been harmed by official admission that the security agencies of the United States had assassinated its own president. Now, 6 decades after his assassination, the truth that is long proven by independent investigators can now finally be recognized, and perhaps it will be. He says that what he addresses instead is how the truth could have been presented in 1963 if only the American government had been up to the task. Once sworn in, Lyndon Johnson could have said something like the following: Dear fellow Americans, our inordinate paranoia, our fear of the Soviet Union, has resulted in our president's death at the hands of the CIA, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Secret Service. Because President Kennedy's efforts to reduce the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union that very recently brought the world close to nuclear war were misperceived by our protective agencies as a sign of dangerous and unwarranted trust in our enemy that left us exposed to nuclear attack. President Kennedy was seen as soft on communism and possibly a traitor. The fault is not in the CIA and the Joint Chiefs. The fault is in the Cold War and the deployment of immensely destructive nuclear weapons. This threat is real and it must be eliminated. Our most urgent task is not to prosecute our protective agencies for their misjudgment, but to terminate the Cold War and ban the existence of nuclear weapons. Our challenge is to learn how to get along, not how to kill one another. The tragedy and our grief over our president's assassination is the fruit of our own paranoia. Our job is to substitute mutual understaffing and trust for fear and mistrust. If not sooner or later, the disastrous weapons will be used. Now, nothing like that could happen because too many people and interests had a stake in the ongoing conflict. The assassination of JFK put Johnson in the presidency. It benefited the power and budget of the military security complex by blaming the assassination on Oswald. And have you heard the latest stuff that they got on Oswald now? That they have a photograph of him standing next to the Kennedy's car as it was driving by? I haven't been able to verify that. I just heard about it, apparently in these papers. But what do they have to gain from Johnson telling the truth and continuing Kennedy's efforts to reduce hysteria and threats? Most disasters, according to Roberts here, in history result from people being incapable of making the right decisions. Today it's Trump and Putin who are being tested. Maybe more so Trump. That is carrying the weight here. Now, there's something else completely different that I wanted to talk about. I saw it over the weekend, and I can't get it out of my head. And that's this USA fencing. I don't mean the fences around your house. The sword fencing. They're defending the trans inclusion policies amid mass backlash over Stephanie Turner kneeling in protest at facing a male opponent. Now, I don't know if you saw the size of this male opponent or if you even know what I'm talking about. But USA, they're having some major competitions going on right now in USA fencing. And there's various classes for both men and women, but not men against women. So she is black carded because she went to her knee when the match with this man 2 to 3 times her size, because I've seen pictures of it, at least twice her size, twice her weight, comes up to start the match with her, and she goes down on a knee because she refuses to compete against a male in this fencing competition. And one of the officials comes up to her and says, "You're going to be black carded for this." I'm not sure of the complete black card. I understand the difference of yellow and red cards in soccer. I'm not sure what a black card in fencing is, if it keeps her out of any future competition or just throws her out of this one. But USA Fencing has undergone a massive policy initiative in recent years to let the trans fencers, as much as possible, get into competition. And because there's an awful lot of this stuff going on now in various sports, I just happened to see this in the news, and as it caught my attention. Now, USA Fencing addressed the controversy in a public statement defending the trans inclusion policies, and they said this: USA Fencing remains committed to fostering an inclusive, respectful community for everyone in our sport. We believe in the principle of creating a safe community where all athletes and community members have a place. So she got a black card for what they called unsportsmanlike conduct. and she was handed a copy of the USA Fencing's transgender policy, and she was escorted away from the premises. Not just, hey, you know, you lost the match by, you know, failure to comply. They escorted her off the property. Now, USA Fencing said, while we understand there are a range of perspectives, USA Fencing will continue to engage in respectful research-based dialogue and review as policy evolves in the Olympic and Paralympic movement, as well as domestic law. Hate speech of any kind is not acceptable, online or in person. Let's keep the conversation respectful and strip welcoming to all, and the strip welcoming to all. Well, you can go through the history of this as to how they got to this point, but it's the same with almost any other sport. You know, with that lady that was present at the president's remarks that he gave to both houses there a month or so ago. She was up in the gallery, and she had been knocked silly by a man playing on the women's team on the other side, and just smashed the ball into her head and knocked her out, gave her traumatic brain injury. So in November 2023, the organization released a list of states that it intended to avoid where possible. In other words, we're not going to have fencing matches in these following states, and that it would flat out not allow major hosting events. And the states on the do not allow list, think about it for a second. What would you expect to see there? Florida, Indiana, Louisiana, Mississippi, Missouri, Montana, Oklahoma, South Carolina, South Dakota, Tennessee, and Texas. These are the states where the fencing, USA Fencing, says we will not have competitions in these states. The states where avoid where possible: Alaska, Arizona, Georgia, Idaho, Kansas, Kentucky, Nebraska, North Carolina, North Dakota, Ohio, Utah, West Virginia, Wyoming, Alabama, Arkansas, and Alabama, Arkansas, Idaho, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Mississippi, North Dakota, Oklahoma, South Dakota, Texas, Tennessee, and West Virginia. This is to avoid where possible. So fencing would avoid Utah where possible. You know, they're all red states. This combination of policies preceded an influx of biological male fencers competing in women's and girls' USA Fencing sanctioned events over the last 2 years. Some of these competitors previously competed in the men's category, and they got their butts kicked. That's why they got out of it. They couldn't beat another man. So if they're going to compete, they got to go where they have a chance of beating somebody. Some of these competitors previously competed. By September 2023, 4 biological male fencers who previously competed in the men's category achieved USA Fencing podium finishes in the women's category. Oh, for crying out loud. So Turner, the girl who took the knee in the black card, in fencing personally, I see it quite often. I've witnessed transgender fencers in women's tournaments and girls' tournaments in different age categories, especially up to Y to 19, the youngest age group, 18. And so I'm looking at a picture here of 4 girls and this man standing next to him. He has more than a full foot of height advantage. His shoulders are much further wider. His legs are much thicker. He's got to be at least 60, 70, maybe 80 pounds greater weight, and has long hair. Now, there's something I want to say about this, because there's something they have to do in order to be able to compete. They can't just, a man can't just walk up and say that I want to compete. I'm a trans female, and I want to be able to compete with other women, other people of my sex. And as difficult as that might be to make sense of that in your own mind, there's a certain qualification that they have to go through in order to qualify to be able to do this. In other words, some guy that just got his butt kicked competing with other men and decides, well, the only way I'm going to win is if I compete with women, so I'm going to go compete with women. They can't just do that. They have to, their first trans inclusion policy in 2023, and I think this is the same with other sports, it allows transgender athletes to compete in a women's category at both junior and senior level after completing 1 calendar year of testosterone suppression treatment. Then proof of compliant hormone therapy must be provided prior to the competition, but the organization has taken even further steps to prioritize its trans competitors. In other words, they're not going to do competition, as I mentioned those states, in states that harm members of the LGBTQ communities. Now, I want to talk about this year of testosterone suppression treatment. You know, it's just something there at K-Talk. All right. You can't just the screen is frozen. Well, that's not good. As I am looking at this now, it does look a little frozen, doesn't it? The voice is coming through, but the... All right, let me, I'm going to leave the studio, and then I'm going to try to... All right, let's see if that didn't make a difference there. So my point of testosterone suppression. Testosterone is what turns a little boy into a man. And estrogen is what turns a little girl into a woman. And the chemical structure of testosterone and estrogen are very, very, very similar. In fact, testosterone is mostly estrogen with a little addition to it. And what happens is, in our bodies, we have, our cells have receptor sites. And by receptor sites, it just means, you know, like a catcher's mitt. On the outer wall of the shell, imagine the cell like a water balloon. And on the outer wall of the water balloon are all these little tiny catcher's mitts. And the catcher's mitt will only let a certain size baseball get into the mitt. Anything else won't get in there. And so take a little 7-year-old boy and a 7-year-old girl. They've got enough estrogen and enough testosterone in both of them that the boy is being boyish and the girl is being girlish. And so you can see that there, you know, normal development's taking place. And then at the point where the gonads start pouring out more estrogen and pouring out more testosterone, then the secondary sexual characteristics start to show up. But it's not just sexual. The brain needs testosterone. The heart needs testosterone. There are receptor sites in the brain and in the heart, in the liver, in the kidneys, in the muscles for these sex hormones. And so when we think about a man who's got ED, or a man who's losing his sexual interest, or a woman who has no sex drive anymore, we always want to blame it on testosterone as though testosterone were the only causative effect. There's several things that can lead to the conditions that I just described. Now, this is not reserved for a health program. This is very political, because this is how these trans sports people are looking at this, that you can't get into a female sports without a year of testosterone suppression. Now, why? Is it because a man who wants to compete with girls can't be looking at the girls as sexual objects anymore, and so in order to do that, we want to suppress the testosterone, just as they do chemical castration to habitual sexual criminals that are in prison? They chemically castrate them. They don't cut their testicles off, though in some cases that might be justified. But they do chemicals to suppress all testosterone production. Well, what happens when you go through testosterone suppression? After the age of 35, a man's body will be producing less and less testosterone. After 35, a woman's body will produce less and less estrogen. A woman will know when her estrogen levels are getting lower when she stops ovulating. So she can't release an egg and can't conceive a child. A man losing testosterone influence, the muscles won't be as tough and hard, the ligaments won't be as strong, but he still will look like a man. And he will still have muscles and strength. Even after a year of testosterone suppression, he still has the muscles he had up to that point, maybe just not as strong and not as hard, and its contractile strength will have been reduced somewhat. But he still has a foot or more greater height, greater mass, and when it comes to contact of some form or another, that mass is everything. So you take this fellow, I haven't seen his name mentioned, just the lady, and I saw the video. I saw him come walking up to the line where they're supposed to tap swords and back up and then start the fencing competition. This guy's immense compared to her. What chance in the world could she possibly have, even after a year of testosterone suppression? You know, and she's been a fencer most of her life. I don't know if the fencer's the right word or not. I've always been fascinated by the sport because we all sword fought as kids. And but she went right to a knee because she could get hurt. On the one hand, on the other hand, she wants to protest men in women's sports. And so there are states listed. We will not have fencing competitions in these states. And then there's other states listed. We ought to avoid these states. And so there's, a dozen states left that are friendly to transgender fencers. And there's this classic picture. I wasn't prepared enough ahead of time to put it up on the screen. But there he is with long hair, and but massive compared to his size, compared to these girls. Now, The USA fencing spokesperson told Fox News that Turner was not penalized for her stance against trans inclusion. She was penalized simply for refusing to fence. Now I'm quoting. In the case of Stephanie Turner, her disqualification was not related to any personal statement, but was merely the direct result of her decision to decline to fence an eligible opponent, which the FIE rules clearly prohibit. According to the International Fencing Federation, technical rules, specifically Article 113, a fencer is not permitted to refuse to fence another properly entered fencer for any reason. Under these rules, such a refusal results in disqualification and the corresponding sanctions. This policy exists to maintain fair competition standards and preserve the sport's integrity. It would be interesting to see how they define fair. So anyway, on Fox News, Stephanie Turner, the female fencer who took a knee against a man pretending to be a woman, speaks out. Shouldn't female athletes refuse to participate in any sport that allows men so their daughters don't have to go through the same nonsense? Amen. And then in the I didn't have time to get into it because we're running out of time here. In the United Kingdom, there was this toddler, I think 4 years old, kicked out of a nursery for being transphobic. as families gathered to support the family of the transphobic 4-year-old for the absolute insanity of the school. That's how, the insanity of Trump allowing a military attack against Iran and the insanity of the coalition of the willing in Europe putting long-range missiles into the Ukraine, and the insanity of Hegseth in the China area trying to get missile bases established against the insanity of that, the insanity of the last few years of the open borders of America. My goodness, to me is only, all of those things is only eclipsed by the insanity of this school in the United Kingdom throwing out a toddler because he's transphobic. I hope you have a happy, good day today. I'm going to laugh about that all day today. Just the absolute insanity of parts of our culture, and men pretending to be women in sports. All right, hold on. All right, we're done with K-Talk. I can end that so that I don't come across them anymore. They'll go right to news. And then for those of you who are on the stream, I hope today was somewhat entertaining for you, bringing you up to date with some important news events, things that are taking place around the planet. More update information for you tomorrow. Hopefully I can find something as entertaining for you as the last few minutes of this program. That just cracks me up. Just throw out a 4-year-old because he's transphobic. All right, you guys be good out there. Keep your wits about you. And